Morning, Rob. How's life treating you today?
Exciting, stoked, excited, because tonight's guest is somebody I've been fanboying for the past year because his work has just been a pivotal part of my life. But before we get to that, I'm getting a lot of good Magic.tv, and people are asking things like, hey, Rob and Wade, when are you going to start offering lessons? And I keep telling them that they're just around the corner. So how has it been for you? Nice mug, by the way. Mine's not as Shango. I have my Doxy. So how has your experience been so far? TV, Wade?
Well, I've been getting good feedback on it, but I'm also getting a lot of activity from my my dead friends that they've been kind of making rustling noises about me getting a temple set up here. And so I might be having a whole nother section on construction and use of a Palo temple out back. So, because
wow.
I'd love they start doing wrestlings and they start moving stuff around, they start arranging things in your life, and you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I've got all of these dead friends that are moving things around for me.
Well, I swear to God, on Halloween, you got to come as like some sort of voodoo hooligan or something like that. Because like one of these days, we're talking about it, we're going to be doing a live ceremony. And heck, if you come to Manila, we might actually do that. And I'm actually trying to get your ass to come over here to Manila. But tonight, I don't want to delay it any longer. We are honored to have the author, published by Anthem of Pop Publishing, of these two amazing books, Entering the Desert and The Cult of Golgotha. These are cryptic books about so many deeper esoteric experiences that it's not the regular stuff you'd see on the bookshelf. This is connoisseur level stuff. This the author, Mr. Williams, is not only an occultist and a magician, but he's also a practicing martial artist. He's been to Tibet. He's done so many amazing things. And I am really eager to pick his brain today about the inspirations behind what his practices, what his advocacies, and he has something special planned for us tonight at the end of the episode. So without further ado, my highest honor to have our third guest in Magic.tv, the ever so badass Craig Williams. Craig, welcome to the show.
Namaskar. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, we're honored to have you. So, Craig, right off the bat, talk to us about your work, man. Entering the Desert, Cult of Golgotha, where did it come from?
Well, thank you so much for the feedback on my work. That's what I always hope that my writings can inspire serious practitioners. That's what I hope more than anything. And then, my work is all rooted in what I typically sometimes refer to as esoteric Hinduism, but on a deeper level, it's more just a type of Vedic science, or and so everything kind of branches out from that. But I grew up deeply kind of exposed to very beautiful environments in Louisiana that had elements of, strange Haitian Creole kind of mixes with kind of mystical Christianity. So that always influenced me as well. And so that all, particularly those two books, Entering the Desert and Cult of Golgotha, I wanted to have those be expressions of that. Although in Cult of Golgotha, I do talk a lot about Hinduism and the Vedic roots of that as well too. But I'm glad we can talk about it. There's a lot in those two books.
All right. Well, as we were talking about off camera, I actually got reintroduced to your work, Entering the Desert, when you were interviewed on Glitch Bottle, and they said it was a great war within Entering the Desert that only the keenest of eyes can find. Was that intentional, or did you just it happened that no, only those who can see can see? How did that happen?
Yeah, yes, that's an interesting question. I did want there to be specific layers in that text, and so it's written in a specific fashion, and then there's certain, I kind of refer to them as there's certain doorways within that text. That is someone, depending on their path or depending on how they're working with material, those things can open up. I wanted it to be a book that anytime someone read it, depending on where they were in their life, they would see something new. And that's what I was hoping.
And that's what it did. Like I was sharing with you guys, I purchased this book at first. I mean, I'm not to call me a dick. I didn't get it. Then after my divorce and I was living alone, you're talking about the cell and you're talking about time dilation and that. And I was like, this guy is talking to me. You know what I mean? He's talking to me. Oh, and it made all this sense. So my next question for you is, and we asked this earlier, but we really need to talk about this. How much of practices like the Abramelin and the search for the Holy Diamond, the whole going the 40 days in the desert and stuff like that, how much of that had or an effect on the creation of entering the desert?
Those are really interesting questions, and I think all those types of pathways that you're referring to are kind of examples of intense sadhana or intense spiritual practice, which builds up what we would call in Sanskrit tapas, or some type of heat, which allows us to transform ourselves, burn away things. So yeah, that really is a big part of that book, that idea. In many ways, I referred to entering the desert as a hidden textbook of Agni, or the sacred flame. And that's kind of hidden throughout that as well too. The next volume, Desert Meditations, will just more graphically explore that. But I think the desert experience, to me, that idea, that environment, the idea that there's a type of solitary environment which is imperative for practitioners to experience to really transform themselves, is very important. And there's also a sobering aspect to that, in the sense that we must all confront our death alone. Each of us will leave this dimension, and hopefully we leave it with a family that loves us, and animals that love us, and friends, and we've helped as many people as we can. But at the end, we will have to face that on our own, and so that's it's almost like a return to the desert that way as well too. So I just think the desert as a metaphor, is so pregnant that we can pull from, and it really influenced me as a child, influenced me as I got older, lived in desert areas, and then while I was in Tibet and those deserts, which are particularly strange, I really was influenced to write this text.
All right, I have two questions now. I'm hoarding because I'm such a fanboy here that I'm going to let Wade ask you some questions, because I'm sure he's got his own. First and foremost, in entering the desert, of course, this is about the isolation and the condensation of the mystical experience away from the world. Your text talking about how the desert is disconnected from the world. Now, is there a way in which, through your desert experience in the book, that this can discovery of a holy diamond or something like the holy guardian angel? Now, of course, it's not the Abramelin, but something into that. Like, could this be a result if I follow your work? Could I have that realization?
Yeah, yes, that's an interesting question too. No, I think that within that environment of the cell, which I discussed in that text, and then one is kind of building a type of inner sanctuary, that one will kind of awaken their inner flame, which is their guide, their spiritual guide for their life. And in many ways, we're always struggling with semantics, and when we talk about deeper aspects of spiritual practice and consciousness, we often have to use language creatively and evocatively. And so, for example, if I say something like, that we through the alembic of the cell, you awaken your inner flame. Actually, from a deeper perspective, that flame was never asleep. It was always there. We just were able to, in many ways, just to uncover it. But we can use metaphors.
Amazing.
We can discuss.
All right. I don't know if I'm getting chopped out or not, and I'm gonna let Wade take a question. Then I'm gonna ask another one, because like internet latency with this in and out. But then, because like as long as one's quiet, we can maximize the conversation. So Wade, you know what? It's just as much your show as mine. You want to ask our guests some interesting things?
Well, a lot of my perspective on the spiritual advancement or ascension comes from Crowley and Thelema, and I was wondering what your experience was with that, what your level of knowledge was there, but specifically where you would place the experience of entering the desert. Like, because when Crowley had his system of Thelema, you would have like mastering practical magic, knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, crossing the abyss, becoming a Magister Templi, speaking your word, and performing your final chug to become the Sisymus. Where would this experience be on that on that gradient?
That's a very interesting question too. 93, as they say. I think that, as a youth and in my earlier years, the work of Crowley was very important to me, and I studied it in depth. I never felt called to ever, refer to myself as a Thelemite or something, but I have deep respect for Crowley's work. I think his work is dangerous. I think his work is wild, and I think that's good. And I think we need work like that in this dimension. I think that the Entering the Desert material would absolutely mirror Crowley's fascination with how important yoga was to his work and how important willpower is for his work. And that's all kind of feeding back into that concept of tapas, or flame, or power, or fire. Now, whether or not one progresses through their practice and has a vision of their holy guardian angel, that's much trickier. That's going to be related to that individual person's karma, their dharma. But I think that the work of Crowley has a lot of important teachings. I think a lot of it's misunderstood. But Entering the Desert could easily be used as a handbook for someone who was practicing Crowley's work or their work. And of course, Crowley had his own interesting experiences in the desert, which I think were pivotal, and that's something that really influenced me. Definitely when I was growing up, to see that, and so that's another big part of why, to me, the desert was such an important environment to discuss, to talk about, to explore.
All right, I have a question, and this is about the cell experience. Like I said, ever since this is practical man's level, I've been kind of like referring to this book time and time again, and especially since I'm somewhat into it. But then this has to do with time. That you said in the book that when you're experiencing the cell, which is basically your isolated space where you allow the spiritual body to condense, you will notice time relations. Okay, and this has happened to me, that like days are longer, and it's not just for me; it's for guests too. They would visit, and they're like, "What? I was here just yesterday. It's been like I've been here for a week." Why, from your experience, does this occur? Is this something person, the intention, the spirits you're invoking? What?
Yeah, it's definitely a reflection of the exploration of deeper states of consciousness. Particularly, you could use the subject of like Advaita Vedanta, or even the work of like Ramana Maharshi and how they talk about that. It's particularly in the cell. It requires two things. The cell is presupposing that you're cutting off external stimuli, right? You're trying to limit how much external noise is happening, and then within the cell, that becomes an environment. When that happens, we're either not leaking out energy, or we're not being we don't have parasites that are kind of draining our energy. And so within that environment, as soon as that happens, if someone consistently does that, then they build up a much more intense perspective. And then as they get closer to an inner experience, as we enter deeper states of consciousness, the concept of linear time dramatically changes.
Very true.
And the pranic body, the mental body, doesn't always live in linear time. That's why we have unfortunate situations like PTSD, or people who have an experience and it's over, it's done, but their nervous system doesn't understand that, their mind doesn't understand. They just live eternally in that trauma. And so there's many time loops and doorways through time, through different parts of the body, and of course those can be used in magical work, but I think just on a fundamental level, we get glimpses of that, and those can be interesting glimpses that our practice is progressing, or that at least that we're kind of dipping our toes into something much deeper. And then it's very unpredictable. How that happens, how it shows, how it reflects is fascinating and interesting. So it's interesting to hear your experience on that.
And as a last follow-up to that, go ahead, Ray. Go ahead, please go ahead.
There's some perspective on that from my own experience, my own training with firearms in crisis situations. Is a lot of it tends to be that you have an increased awareness spiritually,
Mm-hmm.
Something that is a common occurrence. Like if you're in a life-threatening situation, your brain will focus. Your eye, everything focuses. Your whole attention, and you essentially double your frames per second. To use a metaphor, so that you're getting more and more information, but your brain doesn't have the perspective to put that all into a proper time frame. So it seems like an encounter that could last 5 or 10 seconds would occupy about an hour and a half in your mind, because it's all playing out. It appears to be playing out in slow motion, but you can't react as fast as your brain is going. And I've been in those situations, and it seems like you're like, I just checked my watch. This thing happens. You're like, oh my God. Okay, I need to check in. What's going on? Wait, it's been 1 minute and 45 seconds, but it seems like it's been all of an hour or an hour and a half. It just takes up a massive amount, because you're essentially doubling the amount of intake that you're getting because of your increased attention and focus. So, I mean, that is a phenomenon that's been well documented psychologically and physiologically.
Yeah, that's actually a really effective story to share that, because we see all those concepts in martial arts, which of course would be in any kind of escalated situation like that. And that's why martial arts had so many important concepts that were tied in with spirituality. And the same thing happens in Qigong practice. Deeper states of meditation, perception of time can dramatically change. So that's interesting.
Epic. All right, now I have another question about your upcoming work. It's the only one I don't have yet. I've been bugging you about it online. Tantra Volume 1 and 2. All right, you've combined them into one volume, if I'm not mistaken, in a back edition. You want to tell the viewers about that and what we can do from it?
Yeah, Tantric Physics Volume 1 and 2 was recently out in hardback, and it sold out rather quickly. And so the paperback's coming out soon, which will be wonderful. And then the new edition, it'll have volumes 1 and 2, but it also has some new devotional poetry added that was not in the hardback, which is always nice. If we put the paperback out, I like to offer something new. But I'm really happy with that, because I consider Tantric Physics Volume 1 and 2 to be the ultimate root of all my writings, the ultimate root of my practice. And those are, it's an intense expression of my personal experience studying the practices, the sciences from India, in all its aspects, and then how Tantra has a certain worldview or a certain vision. And that's, I was going to mention that that's an important aspect in Tantra, is that they will acknowledge that certain experiences, whether they're traumatic, joyful, based on fear, ecstasy, they can dramatically shift our perception of time, and so they can be used creatively, sometimes more intensely than others. But that's even an aspect of Tantra. But that's what Tantric Physics is about. The paperback, I think, should be out within the next 2 months or so, and that'll be actually always from Anathema Publishing, and then we'll do announcements for that for sure. And it looks beautiful. The paperback edition is just as beautiful as the hardback, which is really, I'm excited about that.
Are you going to be doing ebooks?
No ebooks, just physical copies.
I have a question about the whole practice of the whole Tantra and Eastern mysticism practices. A lot of these are initiatory in nature. Like the little I know about it, especially with my study in Vajrayana Buddhism, you can't act with certain bodhisattvas with initiation. So when the bodhisattva, when the what's it called, the Rinpoche or anybody like the Karmapa would come to town, people would line up to get the initiation. Now, for Tantric Physics 1 and 2, are these initiation requisite practices that you can do, or is this something you can do without the proper initiation?
That's a great question. Well, I would say that the writings within Tantric Physics Volume 1 and 2 are born from my work within initiatory groups. And so I think, and then I discussed that extensively in Volume 1 of the book, the importance of the guru, the importance of the tradition, the importance of the lineage. So I do think there is some importance to that. Sometimes it's just very specific. You might be talking about access to a specific egregore, right? There's certain lineages which have that, so you might need a certain kind of key to get into that egregore. And I know a lot of people in the contemporary world don't like any kind of concepts that start to smell of hierarchies, or any kind of, kind of like smelling of some type of what people refer to as like spiritual elitism. But that's how it is. That there's no way around that, and I don't think everyone has to be forced to study practices that have teachers and lineages, but that's a traditional way that the systems from Southeast Asia and Tibet and Mongolia and all those things did that. Now, of course, many of these teachings came from more ancient shamanistic lineages that didn't have all that. So I think everyone has the potential to access powerful, deeper states of consciousness. But these older systems often provide beautiful maps for us to access and for us to study. And everyone has, and of course, like we can use that metaphor of the map, and we know the map is not the territory, so everyone has to explore that and do that. But you're bringing up your work in Vajrayana Buddhism is just a perfect example of that. I mean, that there are many things within that do require certain type of initiatic work for someone to enter those deeper aspects of them.
Because one thing I've observed is sometimes we seek out to these energies, but other times they seek you out. Like in my own case, I was really hounded by one bodhisattva of Vajrayana Buddhism, which was Vajrakilaya. And I didn't know why this energy, this bodhisattva, was really telling me and get the damn initiation that I flew from Manila to Singapore just for that. And I had to fly twice, but they were like, you're not going to get out of this until you... is there something similar in the tantric practices that it's not you choosing the initiation, it's more like the initiation choosing you?
100%. I think that's the most important thing to discuss. And I always say that. I always say, like, I didn't choose the goddess, she chose me. That I always have referred to that. And so I think that the majority of things in our lives that have the most powerful karmic potential are things that usually, once again, we were talking about these like spatial concepts, like, do I reach out to it, or does, quote, it reach out to me? And those are helpful metaphors for discussions like vectors of how our spirituality is evolving. But I think karmically, sometimes those things they're the closest thing we can get to call destiny or fate. But like you had a good way of phrasing it. You said, I had to listen to that. So many times, we'll hear that or we'll get these messages, but if we don't listen to it, then that won't happen. And that's one of the reasons why the concept of the cell in the desert is so important, because it clears out mirages. It clears out things that might be preventing us from hearing life speak to us, from hearing our karma speak to us, and then we can follow that. Other times it's very easy. You're born into a practice, or you have someone has an experience when they're very young, and it transforms them, and then their life unfolds from that. So everyone kind of enters at a different level, but that your experience with your Vajrayana initiations is a beautiful story, and it shows how many times those things, it's like they radiate out like a radio frequency, and you start to pick it up and try to start, hey, I hear something, I want to tune into that. And then to tune into it sometimes requires travel, working, trying to find someone, getting somewhere, which is a type of, spiritual alchemy in and of itself.
Because segueing to the next part of our show, which is basically the whole current events and advocacy aspect, I'm a fan of your fan page, and there you made a tidbit of another interesting post that I shared on the magic.tv page.
Oh, right.
The virus of modernity. And I wanted you to share about that, because this is something that people are not aware of. If you ask me, it's the COVID of this. How does this affect awakening and awareness of people on a global scale, this virus of modernity?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that. That was an important concept in entering the desert, and then I continued that concept into Cult of Golgotha, where I kind of showed it with these systems of control, these ways that we're trying to limit and control the expansion of human consciousness. What I referred to as the virus of modernity was this obsession with the secularization and homogenation of the world. And that's something which I think is a very frustrating, sad, and definitely depressing concept. Of course, this was deeply influenced by the writings of Rudolf Steiner and his concepts of Ahriman and the times like that. But I think this virus of modernity is very sad, where it starts to cause people to have less and less faith, less and less optimism, and then less and less hope for both their present lives and the future. And that creates a very, very sad, dangerous atmosphere, which there's no lack of examples you could bring this up. And I don't think that there has been, I don't necessarily subscribe to that there was this concept of this like magical time in the past and everything was perfect and now everything's bad. I blatantly disagree with these, what I call this type of Hal Lindsey kind of, apocalyptic vision, which you can see unfolding now in the secular humanist world, who claim to be atheists, but they treat, for example, like climate change as like the chapter of Revelation, that like there's this impending apocalypse and everyone's just going to die and there's no hope for the future. I saw this when I was a child at 10 or 11 years old, and at that time, saw how ridiculous this was. But I think that we are definitely in a time where technology is starting to have an impact on consciousness at a very negative way. And sometimes that's a tricky subject to talk about, because as soon as I say that, there's inevitably going to be someone, who wants to be this ironic, philosopher and says, well, look at you right now, you're on technology talking to each other. And yes, technology is like science. It could be used for healing someone, or it could be used to creating chemical warfare. It can be used any way it goes. But unfortunately, it seems that people are becoming more and more limited by their obsession and use of technology. And then entering the desert, I call it the techno god. People are just, and that's this kind of like this weird obsession with, transhumanism and this, what I call the myth of artificial intelligence, as if like, oh, the artificial intelligence it's just going to come and take over, or it's better, it's worse. It's very strange. And you can, of course, see that compared to people's obsession with drugs and mind-altering substances. It's, a lot of this is just a perfect storm for just a type of spiritual existentialism, which is very sad, and it provides people with no hope. And so the virus of modernity for me is just this concept which really seeks to limit people's hope for themselves, hope for their society, and hope for how they can evolve.
Kind of reminds me of something from Lineage.
Something I've noticed with regard to technology is that it's supposed to be there to enhance our experiences. It's supposed to be there to kind of expand our abilities. And a lot of times what I've seen is people, instead of saying, well, I'm going to maintain all of my, relationships and communication with people, and I'm going to let technology enhance that, they've let it replace that.
Yes.
People talk about using something as a crutch. You know how fast you can gallop on crutches? It's amazing. But most people are content to just limp along because it makes it easier, instead of using it to expand their abilities. And we've seen that. Rob and I have had this conversation 100 times about how the magical community was in the 90s, and it wasn't some perfect golden age in the past. It was, it was terrible. It was god-awful, but it was active. Things were happening all the time. People were doing stuff. They were sitting down in the back of coffee shops, and they were doing stuff. We were breaking into state parks at night to do rituals in a big open field. Now there's people saying, well, I'm going to create a space in Second Life. I'm going to build this temple, and we're going to do it there. Yeah, but that's not... It's real in a sense, but it's not real in the sense that you're actually participating. And that's the thing, is that a lot of people have allowed technology to prevent them from participating. And that's the biggest thing, is that you really have to participate. I keep saying the word over and over again. Yes,
I think that's just such a wonderful expression of that concept and what you're talking about, and you expressed it very well. And of course we can see this, what the most glaring example would be this, that, in the past 2 years, where people had this mythical idea that, oh, if we are just connected on the computer, then there's going to be no effects, and school will be the same, and work will be the same, and everything's going to be the same. But of course, that's not true.
Not at
And
all.
that's not true at all. And now, of course, these people are starting to admit that. But it is that kind of connection. Although it can be helpful and it can be unique. Like, for example, the other day, I was looking for a new translation for an ancient Chinese medical text that was recently published, and I pulled up the book company, and I had a moment, kind of like you with that time loop. I thought, oh my God, I'm 52, and I was like, man, when I started thinking back, I was like 30 years ago when I was looking for these books, there was nothing like this. There was no website, there was no translations. I would have to contact a teacher from school, and he or she would have to write a friend in China, and then they would send me a book, and then we worked to translate it, and it would be, and now it was just like these amazing, beautiful translations and books, and it just kind of, I was like, oh my God, the options today are mind-boggling in its potential. But I don't think it's being necessarily actualized. What happens now is sometimes people see it and then they think, oh, well, I bought the book, then I know it, or I've done this and I know it, but it doesn't mean that they've done the work, that they've had the experience of these things. So I don't want to be a Luddite and live in the forest and have no electricity. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is exactly what you just expressed: is we're losing human connection, and that's a concern.
Yeah, very much so.
It brings me to my next question. I was going to ask you, like, as a practitioner and practically a devotee to these kind of practices, belief style, what can you say is the present state of the study and practice as a whole? Do you think it's getting better, or are the people getting a bit too spoiled about things? They're not working anymore. Like example, I proudly say that I am barely a blue belt in jiu-jitsu.
Mm-hmm.
Got my belt there, but I fought to get that thing. Okay, I really ass off. And then sometimes you see the online seminar, and then they got a blue belt. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, this is a martial science. You got to do this stuff. You're not just like, okay, watch the video, I'm a blue belt. You need muscle memory, you need to bleed, you need to cry. You got to earn that rank, okay? But they always say the belt, it's skill, okay? So with that, is there something similar going on in the spiritual occult world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good analogy too. You guys are very insightful. I mean, to achieve a blue belt in a traditional jiu-jitsu school is excruciatingly painful and extremely hard. And so I think that the martial arts world can be a good example of this kind of, whether someone is really training or whether someone has like a LARPing fantasy world. I think it's a tricky subject, I think, now, because there's so much availability of material, but people are strangely not reading it, and also they're strangely not just doing it. And so I think that's a concern. And then I always wonder, like, what is the reason why someone wants to do occult work? Like, what is the point of this? And I think a lot of people, what they want from occult work, or they might not even know the answer to that question, or they might just want some really basic things that are in the status quo. They want something like money or a partner, or and those things are very easy to get. You don't need occultism to get money, and you don't need occultism to get a partner. And so I think sometimes their goals are strange of what we're trying to do. And then of course, then you have this whole technology which creates all these worlds where people want images, and they have these kind of like mythologies of who they are. And then the only thing that troubles me a little bit too is that, as time goes on, I just hope we don't lose connection with some of the traditional root teachers and teachings, so that, 30 years from now, it'll be even worse. I hope that's not the case. But I always just want to ask people, like, what's the point of your occult work? What are you trying to achieve? What do you want to do? And then to see how your occult work is intimately related to your everyday life. It's not just like this kind of like fantasy world that you kind of put over in the corner and you have a little room that you dress up in. It should be just, they interpenetrate. They should be seeping through each other, and that's in and of itself is even tantra. Tantra is basically saying, no, you don't have to give up this world. You don't have to give up this human body. You don't have to ignore, like same with Vajrayana. You don't have to ignore these emotions. We need to understand them and see them as alchemical doorways. And so that's the main thing. I just hope people stay serious. And then I think another technical thing I will say is that I wish and I hope that people would go back to reading source text. In other words, we don't need another introduction book about Aleister Crowley. We don't need another introductory book about Michael Bertra. We don't need another introductory book about just go back to the source teachings. So many times people ask me, even this past weekend, I was almost going to make a post about it, about people ask me, like, if you had to pick just one book, and that's that. When I hear that, I just instantly, it takes all I can, not just to, and it's the same thing with like wine, right? I love wine. I love to help people find rare vintages of wine. It's one of my joys in life. And that would be if someone came to me and said, if you just had to pick one bottle of wine, it's like, that's impossible. That's not how that's going to work. And so someone asked me, if you had to pick one book on Crowley to read, what would it be? I'd be like, his books, Crowley's books. Go read his books. And they were looking for someone else's opinion of Crowley or someone else's opinion on that. And so I hope people go back to the source text. That's why I'm always trying to get people to study the Nag Hammadi Gnostic scriptures. I'm trying to get people to go back to the source teachings of things, whether it's the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Puranas, or the Vedas, and to go back and at least start to look at those. And then that's not to say that there is not a lot of contemporary writers that have something to say, but we can't forget our roots. I'm a musician. It's the same way. If someone asked me, like, if you wanted to teach someone guitar, what would you do? Well, I'd want to teach them really good traditional stuff. I wouldn't want to just say, oh, we're only going to learn what was written in the past 10 years, and that's what your guitar teacher is going to teach you. I would hope that's not the case.
You'd miss out on a lot.
I guess you'd miss out on a lot of things.
It boils down to one thing, that nowadays people shortcuts that they just don't want to put in work, which leads me, especially like you're saying, what's the best book? No, there is no, what's the best punch fight? No, if you have more than one punch, you're in trouble. Okay? Which brings me to my next. As a martial artist, as a Shifu of Wing Chun and things like that, you say that martial artists would make better practitioners and students of the occult, or that it's like if you're already into martial arts, you might want to consider it, or are these two things that need to be kept separately?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. No one's ever asked me that. I appreciate that. That's a great question. I mean, I think that, of course, someone who's a serious martial artist, in the larger picture, in the sense that they train hard and they see it as a fighting art. They see Kung Fu, but they can also see Kung Fu as the larger definition of just meaning that Kung Fu or Kung Fu can be excellence in anything. And so if they were also training their body, but they were also training their mind, and they were also training their spirit, and they were training in that, then I think they could have a lot of potential there, because that's the one thing about martial arts, is it does, you have to do the work to, hopefully, the school you're in, you have to do the work to achieve these different ranks. And of course,
it requires a pattern of discipline.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's going to have different bodies, right? I mean, as a Sifu, I see this. Like, you can't expect everyone. It's much like a yoga asana or a qigong form. There's a certain way we want to try to get people to teach it. There might be little nuances. Turn your wrist here, turn this. But everyone's body's different, so you can have unique expressions. Just like if you teach someone the pentatonic scale, and then you have 5 different guitar players, and they all sound different, but they're doing the same scale. And so that I definitely want nuance and differences. But I think that the martial arts can create a really disciplined mind, a really focused mind, a patient mind, because occult work takes focus, determination, patience, honesty, and also humility. And then, of course, good martial arts schools teach us to help other people, to be compassionate, and so that's a big part of what I'm trying to help you. Is like, if you're martial arts, if you're by the age of 50 and your martial arts is just about beating people up, that's very sad. You know, I hope that people have learned something else. So I think an occultist could for sure go to martial arts and get a lot out of it. But that's a great question, because it directly speaks to what I was just saying. It's like we can't separate these things. Our occult practice and our everyday life, it's like martial arts. It's like if someone just goes to kung fu or jujitsu on the weekends, and then when they go back to their everyday life, they don't remember anything, then of course it's not going to. But if they go from their jujitsu or kung fu and go back and see, wow, this is making me more patient in my everyday life, and I want to work on this and earn this, then it can be a huge asset. So I think there is a huge benefit to studying the martial arts. And there's so many different beautiful forms, right? Maybe someone doesn't like jiu-jitsu, then they can try Aikido. If they don't like Aikido, they can try Wing Chun. If they don't like Wing Chun, they can try Praying Mantis. If they don't like, I mean, there's so many beautiful options that you can take for someone who maybe doesn't like one thing or thinks one thing is too hard. So and then of course you just get physical vitality, and we want our physical bodies to be healthy.
But there was one benefit.
It also makes you calmer and more confident in a crisis situation, where a lot of people will panic. You'll end up with someone who's confident in their martial arts, and they have a crisis situation, they have a conflict, there's some confrontation at work, and you're just able to handle it, even though you don't have to physically, break somebody's nose. You can sit and handle the situation because you're not panicking. You know you've got that as a fallback, so you can handle it up front with focus.
Yeah, if it's one, so I wanted to share this with Craig, that in my troublesome journey in practicing jiu-jitsu, that I've noticed it does wonders for the ego. You know what I mean? That it really helps tame the ego, because you're getting your ass kicked by guys 1/8 your size, and it calms you down. Like you enter there thinking that you're the UFC, but after an hour or two, you're quiet. You know what I mean? And it really calms the ego, and that's also very helpful in magical practice, because if you're driven all by ego, you're going to blow yourself up. Sometimes you got to shut that thing down a bit. It's like, hey, wait a minute. And jiu-jitsu is a very valuable tool in that, because like I'd spend hours in the gym with my teammates, smaller guys beating me up, so all that bravado is deflated. So when I'm like, well, wait a minute, maybe I don't want to sell my soul to the devil today. You know what I mean? It was very healthy. So that's just one thing I wanted to share with you. I mean, I don't know if it was the same in your practice.
No, I love that story. That's one thing me and my friends who train so hard, we always would say something like, you need to invest in loss, and that's a big thing to get the ego melted, because like you don't really learn in martial arts by winning all the time. You learn more by like losing, especially with a technical art like jiu-jitsu or a technical art like Wing Chun. Then you're trying to develop these tactile skills and to get your nervous system to feel. And if you're just brooding your way through that, you're not really learning. You might be like, beating someone up or something like that, but it's not really helping you truly learn that. So I think that's great. That analogy is so good about how it just helps you humble. And you can see that's why a lot of people are afraid of it, right? A lot of people don't like to go into that because they're forced to confront their ego, how they feel about things. And so that can be helpful. So I'm always, and then of course it requires a really good, compassionate, patient, and well-trained teacher to help people see this, to show people this. Because I've had a bunch of teachers that have been bullies, and I've had classmates that have been bullies, and I've had teachers that have been amazing, inspirational figures that have changed my life. So we always hope that we have teachers and classmates that are helping us to understand it, so we can all grow. And that's once again, that's a great metaphor for the world, how it could be potentially in the world as well.
And this brings me
to parallel about that is between martial arts and magic, is that with the internet you get the same group of badge collectors on both sides. People that they say, well, I've watched this video, I read this book. I used to call them the people from the Iroquois tradition. When I worked at Ancient Ways, they would come in because I read a couple of books. It's the Iroquois, and they would come in and they're the master of this and that, and they've got all these things. But now, especially with the internet, they can just go and download a book, read it, or watch a couple of videos and call themselves experts. Or they can buy a certificate online and download it, and oh, I'm now a high
Yeah.
priest of Yoruba. And it's really kind of diluting the practice, or it's diluting the art, but the actual practice is always going to be handled by genuine masters. And that's, I think, a lot of the disconnect is when people they're living their life on the internet. They can talk the talk all they want. They can read about things, and you know how, like in the New Age system community, you'll hear people talk about, oh, the healing white light, or the golden dawn, or the silver star. Yeah. These were actual experiences that people had and wrote about. Someone else read them and said, oh, I can relate to this. But it doesn't mean that they had the experience, just that they've read the words. And they can recite them back, but they can't put it in perspective for you. And we're seeing a lot of the same parallels between martial arts and the magical community on that.
And this brings me to my next question for Craig as a Shifu, because I've observed in my study of the martial arts that even and this also overlaps with the magical as well, where these things, psychologically, your issues will come out. Your insecurities, I don't understand why, because why is it that my insecurity is coming out? Why is it before competition I'm having an anxiety attack? And if you're doing the same thing in the martial arts, you're having the same thing with the magic. It's like, okay, if I'm going to summon Ouroboros today, that same issues are going to come out. Now, I wanted to ask you as a Shifu, why is that in these practices like martial arts and magic, they tend to extract your issues instead of...
Yeah, that's a great question, too. One of my dearest friends and colleagues and teachers, Sifu Jeff Hughes, and he's in the Mansa style, and he always says that, you know, black belts get really good at hiding their weaknesses. And he would often say, so he would have to train with someone for a long time, and then it's like a detective work. And then you're like, and then all of a sudden one day you're like, there it is. I found it. That's the thing. There's something there. So I think our occult, and that's a good thing, right? You would hope if that was your teacher that you'd be like, okay, you found this, because people can get so good at hiding their weaknesses that they'll forever, they don't grow. So I think spiritual practices like that, as we progress, we are hopefully kind of working on ourselves, because we're all human. Everyone's working on themselves. Just because we're all sitting here talking about that and maybe providing some constructive criticism doesn't mean, and I don't feel a tone of anybody here that we're saying, oh, we're better than everyone else or everyone's stupid. No, we're just talking about like our concerns for something. And so I think that's the same way with our intense martial arts or intense spiritual practice. If it's done consistently, and if someone does it with sincerity, then there's going to be a continual growth, and hopefully people are open to that, and then they'll see, wow, I'm still growing, I'm still changing. I see that constantly with myself. I mean, I'm 52. I've trained martial arts so hard since I was like 11 or 12 years old, and I think in the past 5 years, my perspective has changed again, and I remember thinking, wow, I'm changing again. There's this constant growth, and what was important to me 5 years ago in martial arts it's just not important anymore. And that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with that. So sometimes people might have like some type of breakdown because of that, because they define themselves as something, right? Oh my, this is who I'm supposed to be, and this is what I do. If you change, or if you see these like little, mile markers on the road that something different might be coming up, we should be open to it and say, okay, I can change, I can still learn. And that's kind of, I'm speaking really basic things. This is what they would call like beginner's mind, right? You're always trying to stay open and let those things. So I think if you're doing the work, then you'll see that. If you're doing the intense work, then you'll see continual change, continual challenge, continual growth. Now, that doesn't mean that your life has to be a continual train wreck. It does not mean that at all. It doesn't mean that you have to constantly be having meltdowns and breakdowns. That's not it at all. But it just means we should be consistent in our practice, and that we should be open to seeing change. And that's why it's good, like you mentioned earlier, this like actually meeting and talking, and that's an important thing. That's why dialogue with people, or having students and classmates and friends, and that you can talk, and when things happen, you can go to people for advice, ask them for advice, and it's not such a solitary practice. A lot of our practice will be solitary, just like I mentioned. Their death will be solitary. But in the meantime, there's still a lot of benefit to association and how that can help us. So that's a great point, that we should consistently see subtle changes as we grow, as we practice in our life. It's the same thing too with food, right, or wine. I would hope that over time my palate has matured, right? I can taste different things now than I did when I was 20 or when I was 30. And it doesn't mean that I've given up other things. It just means, oh, I've changed. I'm okay with that. That's sometimes I feel this is a really mundane example, but it breaks my heart when someone comes to me and says, there's this one wine, it's the only wine I've ever liked, and now they don't have it anymore. And I'm just like, that's just like, there's so much in the world. That's like saying, like, this one friend I had was the only friend I ever had. And it's like, no, there's so much beauty and so much out there. You just want to kind of expand their perception of that reality. And so I hope that everyone's intense spiritual practices is allowing them to grow, change, be open to growth, be open to personal evolution, and then also be open to cultivating compassion and patience in the world. We need more of that for sure.
I agree 100%. And just wanted to thank you for this awesome sharing of your advocacies and your beliefs. It's very helpful. But of course, now we're
Rob, I think something that you had mentioned reminded me about because when you talk about that brings up your insecurities. Something that I've noticed is that when you're getting ready to make your crossing, like crossing the abyss, as you discover these insecurities, it's not like a weakness; it's another part of yourself that you have to learn to live with. Like if you say, "Well, I've got a bad knee, I'm going to work around that," instead of saying, "Oh, I've got a bad knee, I'm going to power through that and try to do things the way that everyone else does them." But when you make your crossing, you have to not just recognize, but accept all the terrible things about yourself. When you look at it, you're like, wow, I'm kind of a jerk off. I'm kind of a bully. I can be cruel when I'm angry. And you just, instead of pushing these things away and letting them sneak up on you when you least expect it, you have to accept that about yourself and work with it. So it brings up your insecurities because you're getting to know more about yourself, not because it's a bad experience. You're just becoming more of a whole person.
Yeah, 100%. That's so. Those ideas are so important.
All right, that's very true, Wade. I agree with you on that. You learn to incorporate all aspects of yourself and being because of that. So with that being said, now we're going to be shifting to our Occultex segment. Every time we finish the last part of the show, speakers give a personalized lesson for everybody tuning in. This will be available for download. It'll be converted to a PDF, of course, giving all credit to Mr. Craig Williams. We're not claiming that we created this. We're just simply saying that we learned it from him, straight from the Shifu's mouth. So what do you have for us today, Craig?
I think, I was thinking about that when you mentioned that, and that's what I was thinking about this past week and at my clinic and with patients. And these past years, the biggest thing that I've seen happening is that people are just living in an atmosphere of constant worry and constant fear. And fear and worry are like parasites, which just drain us. We can use if we want to use the language of Chinese medicine, it drains us of our qi. It damages certain organs. Or if we wanted to use the language of Ayurveda or yoga, we would say it drains us of our prana, or it causes intense pranic stagnation. And then as a result of that, we get sickness and disease, both psychological and emotional sickness, but then straight up physiological sickness. So I think what I always tell people is they need to take an inventory. I call it almost like a fear inventory or a worry inventory, and start to see and kind of map out areas in their life in which they live in constant fear and worry. And one of the things I've seen most consistently is that people who watch the news constantly tend to have that more. And so I think that that's an unfortunate example of what we were earlier talking about technology. Is like now we live in a time when the news. I remember when the news would sign off at night, the screen would go fuzzy, or there'd be old movies or playing. Now it's just looped 24/7, and people are on their phone reading the news 24/7. And the news is it's apocalyptic porn. It's just constantly doom and gloom. And so I think people need to take an inventory about how much they're obsessing about negative news, how much they're obsessing about worry and fear. And there's many ways you can do this. You can just write it down, and then you could work with a professional counselor or a therapist on this. That's important. That's a great thing to do. Or you can work with an acupuncturist or a health coach. But you can also do your own rituals, where if there's one or two things in your life that seem to be the most important worry or the most common fear, is you can write that down and then have a nice little ceremony with the fire, and then throw that into the fire and let that clear it out of your life. That's one of my favorite things to do, which is kind of almost like an Agni ceremony. It's a way of just throwing your worries into the fear. But I think we need to use all that, because even if we write something down and throw it into the flame, people will still hold on to it, right?
Yeah.
Just because they've written and thrown it down. So that's why I think working with like a therapist or a counselor or a health coach or someone that you feel you have a connection with to really get to where these roots are can be very important. But I think unless people look at what they worry about and what they're constantly afraid about, they're always going to be limited in how they can grow. And then it just causes illness. It just causes sickness and disease. It causes a lot of psychological and emotional damage. And that's an important thing to do. And that's, I often say the less fear and the less worry we have, the more immune you are to the virus of modernity. And I think we can use those concepts.
If you don't mind, Chifu, can I use my example on the show? We can nitpick it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm sure people are going to ask questions after they watch the replay. Like for me, I have a huge fear of the dead children or my dog, like especially my dog.
Sure.
Yeah, that paralyzes me. Like every time my dog gets sick, everything, all the machismo and everything is gone. It's like I melt, and that's fear because I love my dog. What more with my kids?
Yeah,
I don't want to lose it, but I want to know how to like kill that paralyzing fear. Because, like, I could be having a beer with you in Austin, Texas. I find out my dog is sick. I'm on the first flight back to Manila.
Yeah. That's, I think, to be honest with you, I think that's a very beautiful thing that you shared. But, because I recently lost my dog.
Oh, man, sorry.
And so I know exactly what you are talking about, and so animal rights are a huge thing for me. That's something that my entire life has always been this strange obsession with saving animals. So I really work hard and all these different ways, and so I often adopt, or I always adopt senior animals that nobody wants, right? So I adopted one there, and so of course it's very hard because they don't live as long, right? So you're always there. But I recently had one that lived so long, and she was so beautiful. And I remember toward the end that I felt that familiar fear. I was like, oh, not now. Maybe just a little bit longer. Because when we think about how we love our animals, there's never enough time with them, right? It's never long enough. But I think we can learn really beautiful lessons from this. We can learn about compassion. We can learn about the ephemerality of love, but how special it is. And then we can also learn not to take anything for granted, especially time. And these are things we pay lip service to, right? We often say things like, oh, right, yeah, life is short. And but really, with animals and our relationship with animals can be a really powerful alchemical alembic to really learn what this means. To learn that no, time is precious. I don't have much time. So I always think about that with my animals. Now I think I don't have that much time with this animal. And that's the reason why I think this is beautiful, because it ties actually in to even our time discussions, because time becomes compressed, right? Okay, I'm only going to have 8, 9, 10 years, maybe 13 years with this dog or cat. It's just so intense. As opposed to human friends, we assume I've got 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, however much time I have if we're lucky, right? And so And so I think that's what we can learn. We can learn that each moment is precious. These animals can teach us so much, and then they can teach us the dignity of death, and they can teach us how that it should soften us. These experiences in life should kind of melt away the kind of sludge that accrues daily from fear and worry. So that's why I often tell people, I just love that you shared that, because I often tell people, like, hey, if you're constantly worried and if you're constantly afraid, go adopt shelter animals. Go volunteer at a shelter. Go help be a foster. And then all the time that you would spend watching the news, or all the time that you would spend worrying, go spend that time taking care of that animal. Now, of course, we could say the same thing about a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter or anything. So, I just think that the animal is just a great thing we brought up. We can also do that with humans as well, too. But I think that's what it can teach us. It can teach us cherish our lives, not take anything for granted, and learn how to be compassionate and let us experience our emotions, not hold our emotions away, and just like we don't want to hold away our losses in martial arts, we don't want to hold away our emotions that we might feel with an animal, because as the animals age, it's inevitable. It's right in front of our face, and that's something we can learn from. So I appreciate you sharing that, but I talk about that a lot privately. So it's nice that we can talk about this publicly.
Yeah, and they're very impactful.
Having the shelter animals, having them, knowing, having a pet and knowing that you're going to outlive it can also teach you lessons about how to die with dignity, because you might be concerned about how your children, that you're concerned about your children possibly dying, but you know that at some point, some definite point, 30, 40 years down the road, your children are going to have to deal with you dying. Because if life is a feast, then death is a dessert.
Yep.
And 100%. You have to learn how to die with some semblance of dignity and get some closure before that happens.
100%.
So having a shelter animal, you can kind of watch how to do it right.
Yes, I totally agree. That's why I think this is such a beautiful analogy. It helps us become more of who we are. It helps us to see the beauty and the human experience and the human embodiment. And we definitely need more compassion out there. So it teaches us more of that as well.
Using the word, Craig, I got to ask you this question, because I've seen martial artists that are total dicks, okay? And I don't even martial artists, I want to call them fighters. But the martial artists I've met, deadliest men I've ever met, have the deepest sense of compassion. And like, you could kill 12 men with your bare hands if you wanted to, but there's this radiating energy of gentleness and compassion. But sometimes, in the midst of learning to use the sword, you forget to use the heart. What secret to, being this badass, but also being so compassionate and loving to animals, to people? Like, it's like, I don't do it at all, but I wouldn't want to piss you off in a bar. You know what I mean? What was your secret to combining these two worlds?
Well, I think that I was very gracious and lucky enough to have just amazing teachers throughout my life, and that taught me a lot. And I really listened to them, and then I try as much as I can to support people who are teaching me and helping me. And so there's a kind of a nice reciprocity there. And so that's often humbled me. And then I think I've always been so, adamant about keeping our spiritual practice enmeshed in our everyday world, and not looking to our spiritual practice as some kind of fantasy world, but that we can learn every day. And then I think also, too, to be honest with you, that my practice of medicine has changed me, right? My path of medicine, you're constantly seeing suffering, you're constantly seeing sick people. So that humbles you, and then you realize how lucky you are to have a healthy body. That's what I often tell people whenever they're like arguing or they're mad about something, mad at someone. And if it's, I often try to tell them, like, hey, especially if it's not something where it's life, if someone's not, killing someone or something, I often say, you're so lucky that you have health right now. You're so lucky that you have, your children are healthy, you're healthy, your family's healthy. Just don't take that for granted. Don't spend the time in negative ideas, making more beautiful memories, because life is so short. And I think, also, too, like I said, my working with animals has made me realize like time is so short. It really is. We have to really cannot take that for granted. Don't waste time being angry or negative. Help as many people as you can. And anytime you do feel negative and anytime you do feel worried, take that energy and then go help someone or go help an animal or help someone else. And then there's lots of ways to do that. That's what I'm saying. Like there's so many ways that can do it, but it really is important to do that because that in and of itself is a type of medicine. So I think that's hopefully gives you an answer to that. So.
Yeah, we have actually a user comment from beautiful. Thank you for caring so deeply for animals. I don't think people give themselves enough permission to grieve for their animals when they pass. The interview. Oh yeah. Wow. I mean,
that's huge. I was telling someone the other day. It was like you really have to give yourself time because the grieving process is so important. And like we talked earlier, like you don't want to cut off emotions. You don't want to hold them back. You don't want to wallow in emotions, but you want to let them out. And in the grieving process, with animals, it can be big, But in the same sense, what I always say is my part of grieving is to go save another dog. And I know that doesn't work for everybody, but I always say okay, I'm so sad, but I'm going to take all this grief and I'm going to go save another animal because that needs to be saved. And it doesn't replace it. It doesn't make it better. You still feel the grief. You still feel the pain. You still feel the loneliness. You still somehow want to see your old cat or dog, but it softens over time, and you're helping another animal that needs that, and that is this big medicine that we all could learn from.
I want to throw down on this. Craig, I'm just going to be vulnerable with you on this. I never thought that I could have met such a balance of both, both aspects. Because usually, like when I first saw you, I said, man, this guy's a badass. He's probably going to be like blading Metallica in the background. But at the same time, you're also talking about how you save animals. And if you ask me, this is the ultimate synthesis that all practitioners of the occult should strive for. It shouldn't be, I'm a satanic dark worker, or no, I'm a love and light, namaste. You need both.
Right.
They both need to come together. And the problem is, those on the dark say, oh no, that light worker stuff is wussy crap. And those on the dark worker stuff is evil, it's going to kill us all. But the truth is, we are all beings of yin, yang, light, and darkness. And when we bring them together, the amazing things we could do, because we are complete. And I'm seeing it in you. I'm like, wow, I'm dumbfounded, man. I'm dumbfounded. I mean, and I wish I could have. We got to have you again on the show. I know I've taken up a lot of your time, and we've learned so much about you. But before we, of course, do the closing, I just wanted to allow you to tell any of the viewers, because this is going to be on YouTube, Spotify, where they can find your work, where can they buy your stuff, what can you recommend they buy, or if they want to take workshops with you, find you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been an honor. You guys asked the smartest questions. It was so creative and fun. Thank you for asking that too. Yeah, all my work is published through Anathema Publishing, so that'll come out to them. And Entering the Desert is available as a paperback now. Cultic Agatha is available in a paperback now, and Tantric Physics will be out in paperback very soon. My next book, which I'm working on now, is called Desert Meditations, a Gnostic Cartography, a Handbook of Agni Yoga. And it's going to be a little bit of a continuation of the concepts Entering the Desert with a lot more practical discussion. And then I'm going to bring in a lot more of Ayurveda and yoga into it as well. And so that will be out in like mid-2023, late 2023 or something. That's coming down. And I'm constantly writing on my blogs and doing that as well too. So they can find that. That's pretty easy to find. And then hopefully, after people listen to this, they might be inspired to go out and volunteer at a shelter, help someone, whether it's a cat or a dog or a horse or a human. If they want to do anything like that. So we can't ignore those aspects of life with our occult work. They're so important.
Dead, man. And Wade, do you want to say anything to Craig before we let him say the famous saying at the end of the show?
When you were talking about dark work and light work, we used to have summits at Pathfinders when I had my own bookstore. when we would have the light workers would gather and they would work. 2 weeks later, we would have the dark workers show up at the same store. But in between those two meetings, we would have summits where they would each kind of coordinate, where the light workers would coordinate with the dark workers, so they weren't working against each other. They were going for common goals. If one said, we want to promote this positive stuff in the community, the dark workers like, we want to get rid of all this negative stuff. They would coordinate everything without malice, without opposition. Everybody would work together, and it was great. It was really a productive time. So I think a lot of people need to look at themselves and say, I have to coordinate the things that I want to build versus the things that I want to destroy. And a lot of that goes back to this work and making yourself a more complete person.
If it's
it's a more of a common experience.
If it's my wish after the day is that this can be a bigger current, that both of these aspects learn to work together for the better of humanity, because the world needs warriors, the world needs healers, and the world also needs builders. Okay, we're in a very tumultuous time right now. I mean, it's very uncertain. I think everybody has their own gifts, and we've got living, breathing proof that this is possible. And as long as love, compassion, and shown, nothing is impossible. Okay, nothing is impossible. I mean, Craig is living proof of that. Wade, you're living proof of that. Me as well. And you know what, Craig? I'm really going to beg you for a second episode, especially when Tantric Physics comes out. And,
it's my honor.
I'm probably going to fly out to Texas to have you sign it. Okay, I'm not going to take a nonsense. All right, so before we shut up, is there anything you want to tell us or the fans about what you're on right now? Take it away, Craig.
That's it. That's good. We covered it all.
All right, so we have a special saying that all our guests say at the end of the show. Please say who you are and where you are right now.
This is Craig Williams in Austin, Texas, and it's an honor to be on Magic TV.
All right, thanks for having us, Craig, and see you all next week, because I'm proud to announce that our next guest is going to be another interesting fellow. I'm gonna blast it right now to surprise the people. You're not going to be cut off just yet, but I'm going to end the stream. Guys, thank you very much. See you next Sunday, 11 p.m. Manila time. So let's end the stream. I'm still going to be in the back room. Play out.